So, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to Washington DC. It's a beautiful day here. Before I begin, I would like to invite people. I'm actually working on an edited volume, a new book, an edited volume on the 2018 World Cup. And we put together a proposal which we sent to the publisher, and the publisher very helpfully said, well, actually, we want 4 more chapters. So I have spaced for some more people. So if anybody's interested in contributing a chapter, please feel free to send me an email with your proposal, what you'd like to write about. We're pretty much interested in anything apart from the soccer itself, although we might make exceptions for that. So my talk today is called Russian Extremism and the Forms of Violence, forms of ethnic violence. And the broad theoretical question I began with is the question of why are there different forms of ethnic violence? This is an interesting question for a number of reasons. First, because, as Mark Beisinger notes, one of the most interesting yet infrequently addressed questions is why nationalist violence assumes the forms it does. It's also interesting because instrumentalism has become a really strong and really achieved some explanatory value in explaining ethnic violence, whereby elites inflame ethnic conflict. However, there's not much specification of how they do this. It's just normally the presentation of evidence, which is they deploy these negative images and then we get violence. But also because it offers us a potential guide to escalation, knowing at what particular time ethnic violence is likely to take a particular form or not. So in looking around for a case, I settled on the case of Russian skinheads, Russian neo-Nazis, Russian skinheads, because I was working on a database and constructing a database of skinhead violence at the time with Professor Mikhail Alexeyev of San Diego State, and what we noticed was that all the 4 kinds of violence, which I'm going to address shortly, all the 4 kinds of violence appear to be in evidence in the case of extremism. So the skinhead movement in Russia, it has a fundamentally British origin. The skinhead movement originated in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in part as a reaction to immigration, especially from Jamaican groups. Originally it was not racist. It became racist throughout the 1970s and 1980s when it was hijacked by racist groups. It then spread throughout Russia throughout Europe in the 1980s and came to Russia, as with many other Western ideas, in the early 1990s. You can see the picture which is on your left here is of the apartment building where I stayed in Moscow in 2006. In the apartment next to the one where I was staying, there were 2 young men. I guess they were about 12 or 13, and what was really notable to me was that they had written on the wall in English, "Skinheads forever." You know, these are 2 very young Russians writing in English on the wall. Not the most surreal experience I had on that trip, actually. That was probably when I listened to those children who I talked about earlier and their colleagues sitting outside in the playground where they were drinking with their friends, singing Deutschland, Deutschland über alles in the middle of Moscow. It was quite surreal. So the skinhead movement came to Russia in the 1990s, as Victor Schnirelman tells us. In 1997 was when they really started receiving great support from their comrades in Europe. But the skinhead movement became enormously more popular under Putin. This is really a feature, one of the things that really became very popular under Putin's early regime, such that in 2001 there were about 3,000, or an estimated 3,000 skinheads in Russia, but by 2006 there were an estimated between 50,000 and 65,000 skinheads, which was half the world's total skinheads residing in Russia. This was part of the reason that the United Nations sent Special Rapporteur Dudu Dien to Moscow in 2006 to investigate the roots of this phenomenon. So skinheads, apart from getting around in circles, drinking and singing, one of the things they participate in is racial, ethnic violence, And as you can see on the picture on your right, this is a particularly gruesome instance of ethnic violence, and excuse me, this is going to be quite explicit. This was a video taken, I believe, in 2008, when skinheads evidently abducted two men from the Caucasus, forced them to kneel underneath a giant swastika flag, presumably outside Moscow, but no one's really sure, and then proceeded to saw the head off of one of them on camera and shoot the other one in the head. This, they claimed, was designed to send a message of don't come to Russia, we don't want you here, or don't come to Central Russia, we don't want you here. Everybody thought this video was a fake until somebody said, oh, actually, that one's my cousin or my brother, or something of that nature. So, any work that's going to ask why there's different forms of ethnic violence has at first to typologize those forms of ethnic violence, to say what they are. And building on the work of the sociologist Charles Tilley, I constructed a typology of ethnic violence which focused on his insight that violence is a kind of conversation, however brutal or one-sided that conversation might be. Ethnic violence, I argue, sends particular messages, and those four particular messages I conceived of as commands, and violence not being able to really send any message other than a command. The messages were cower, behave, leave, and perish. And taking from Tilley's typology, I looked at the number of targets as being split between few and many, and the nature of the targets as being either property or people. Now, while the distinction between property and people is quite apparent is quite a readily accessible difference, of course, few and many is a subject for discussion, but the number I settled on in a small scale, in an example of small scale violence like this, was 3 or more, countless many. So, what the violence that focused on few people, on few property targets, sending the message of cower, I called symbolic violence. And the best example I can give of this from the literature was Northern Ireland murals. Those murals in Northern Ireland featuring Protestant or Catholic militaries holding guns and really saying, this is our area and you better know that. In the terms of sending the message of behave, that is, violence that focuses on few targets and on actual people, I called lynching, and the best example from the literature of this was that of the deep violence against African Americans in the Deep South. African Americans often being punished for an alleged or reported violation of an assumed normative moral code, such as associating with white women. In case of property violence focused on many people, sending the message of leave, I called this pogrom, itself a word which has Russian origins, coming from the verb to thunder, and of course flight from thunder being a very rational reaction. And the best example I found in the literature of this was a Kristallnacht in 1938, when all across the Third Reich, young neo-Nazis smashed up Jewish shops and destroyed Jewish synagogues, after which we did indeed see emigration from the Third Reich peak. And then my final kind, and I'm reluctant, I don't want to call this ideal typical theorising, which is what it is, but because I'm going to talk about ethnic violence and no form of ethnic violence is ideal, but I used my fourth term was called massacre, that is violence that focuses on the bodies of people and focuses on many targets and in the message of perish. And again, the example I had here from the literature was of the 1905 Armenian genocide. So I then set about constructing my database of ethnic violence in the Russian Federation from skinhead groups, which I constructed with Professor Mikhail Alexeyev. And the analysis of the data showed that the ethnicity of the victim was the best predictor of the form of violence. Skinheads use characteristic forms of violence against ethnic minorities. And this is really apparent in 3 of the 4 cases that I can show you up here. The violence against Jews, it seems that the characteristic or dominant form of violence is that of symbolic violence. This took the form of daubing swastikas on synagogues or desecrating Jewish graveyards, but also, and importantly, of erecting anti-Semitic signs by highways. You know, they could have chosen to continue desecrating these things, they just erected signs by highways. In the case of Africans, the dominant form of ethnic violence used was that of lynching. As you can see there from the table, something like over 80% or 85% of violence against Africans took the form of lynching. And a number of high-profile lynchings really flesh this out. First, the lynching of the African, or what I term lynching of the African-American librarian at the US Embassy in 2002, Lucas Murdoch. Secondly, the murder of Sinkala Kelvin Benson in 2004 in Vladimir, a medical student from Zambia. And finally, the 2006 stabbing of a 9-year-old Afro-Russian girl in St. Petersburg, where skinheads burst in on her apartment, stabbed her, and I believe, as I remember, they threw her over the balcony, although I need to check on that. And then the third case in which was clearly a characteristic ethnic group for a particular form of violence is that of Roma, where most, a slight majority of the violence used is that of massacre. And the best example here was of a 2006 attack on the outskirts of Volgograd when skinheads burst in on a Roma camp with iron bars and baseball bats and proceeded to beat to death 2 people and put another 8 in the hospital. But this, of course, left one of my types of violence without an ethnic group to represent it, and that was pogrom. Now, I do say I use the term Caucasians, and I use that term here to refer to Caucasians and Central Asians. And the reason I use that, I'm trying to appropriate the skinhead worldview without taking on board some of its negative terminology. So the word they use, the Shawnee, the blacks, we're going to refer to both groups, but I don't want to replicate that in my work, so I just label them Caucasians, and that does not mean white people. So I analysed pogrom to see against whom most pogroms were used, and what I found was that most pogroms were in fact used against Caucasians. So while there are more lynchings against Caucasians as a group, in fact most pogroms are used against Caucasians. Here, the raid on the Yasnevo market in 2001, when skinheads ran through the market, turning over stalls and beating up traders, is an example, or throwing an occasional punch. So I then had to explain, how do we explain this? How do we explain why we see these different forms of violence used against Jews, and against Africans, and against Roma, and against Caucasians? And what I came up with, and I actually owe this, the final term I gave this theory to Marlene, who pushed me on it a little bit, was the theory of ethnic vigilantism. Originally I called it the theory of ethnic criminology, but Marlene said that's not really what it's saying here. And the idea here is that perpetrators of ethnic violence believe themselves, or look at themselves as vigilantes, who are punishing ethnic groups who they believe as have based on their stereotypical crimes. They believe ethnic groups have committed stereotypical crimes, and they are acting as punishers, as people who are meting out justice. There are a number of reasons why the criminal metaphor is particularly apposite to explain ethnic violence here, and first of which is that neo-Nazis and all perpetrators of ethnic violence, I would venture to suggest, usually couch their justifications in defensive terms. They don't normally present themselves as the aggressors. They say we're sticking up for the community, we are defending a value, we are protecting people, we're not aggressing against anyone. We're the aggressed. Secondly, because the discourse of criminality, by saying someone is a criminal, it places them outside of the civic community. After all, in our own society, we believe it's right and just that criminals be punished for what they've done. Of course, those are criminals who, at least we hope, have been through a fair and just trial. The third reason, a really great theoretical reason, is that the logic of proportionality gives us a really elegant and simple theoretical mechanism by which violence takes different forms. But importantly, and really here I'm talking to Benjamin Valentino, who tried to explain mass genocides in the 20th century as a result of a lot of weapons getting into the hands of the wrong people. Really, it helps us avoid reifying the perpetrators as psychopaths. It helps us avoid saying, well, the fact that they've committed this violence means they're a psychopath. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. Because to me that begs the question. Why do we see so many more psychopaths under given social conditions rather than others? Anyone can become a Nazi under this view. So my imaginatively titled 4 categories of violence. Again, I've used the people property distinction. I looked at the imminence of crime as being vague or concrete. Vague forms of crime being simply those which are abstract and are going to happen at some point, but the consequences aren't felt immediately. Those concrete crimes are those that have a specific place and a time, are happening in this given area. And I have, so type 1, crimes of type 1 vague property crimes will lead to symbolic violence. Crimes, stereotypical crimes of type 2 will lead to, that's vague people crimes, will lead to lynching. Concrete property crimes of type 3 will lead to pogrom. And crimes of type 4, that is concrete crimes against people, will lead to massacre. So I then evaluated this theory using content analysis, and I conducted a content analysis of over 2,100 articles in the skinhead media. Alexander Vygotsky of Moscow's Servat Center had until recently a very nice compiled website showing different links to different skinhead organizations. That's where I got most of the data from. Now, most of those skinhead organizations, their websites at least, they've been closed down by the Russian government, so they're no longer available. And I think last time I looked for Vygotsky's list, it had actually been removed as well. But the first step was just to confirm that criminality was in fact the dominant way by which skinheads the dominant image that skinheads associated with ethnic groups. And as you can see, the skinheads often deployed the image of crimes and criminality with ethnic minorities, as opposed to any of my other 3 explanations from logical explanations from the literature. So I evaluated the theory of ethnic vigilantism by breaking down those criminal stereotypes according to the typology that was developed according to the theory. And we do, in fact, see some support for this. This provides good support for the theory of ethnic vigilantism. Jews were overwhelmingly accused of vague property crimes. Africans were accused of vague people crimes or vague personal crimes more often than they were accused of anything else. Caucasians were accused of concrete property crimes more often than they were accused of anything else as well. The one case where this doesn't work is the case of the Roma, who were accused more of concrete property crimes than they were accused of concrete people crimes. This is, but by far the overwhelming image relating to the Roma was simply that they weren't even mentioned. They were just absent, pretty much. I think there were 11 mentions of the Roma in all those articles. So this led me to the conclusion that the image and the identity of the Roma is replicated using other mechanisms than through the media. So, having some limited support, having some support for the theory of ethnic vigilantism from my content analysis, I used some interviews. I supplemented this with interviews, interviews of individuals who perpetrated ethnic violence. I conducted in-person interviews, and later, when those got a bit dangerous, moved to internet or chat room interviews with perpetrators of Skinhead Violence, as well as with experts. I had 6 interviews with skinheads in person. I decided, and these are 2 of my interview subjects, so you can see up there on the pictures. I decided to go online when this became a bit dangerous. That was after one of the skinheads took a picture of me, and then I started getting harassed in the metro by skinheads. So I kind of made up the decision that I should probably go into a different way of evaluating this. So I conducted 12 chat room interviews. Again, it was difficult to get the chat room interviews because most of the people who were talking to me thought I was working with the secret services. I forget how many times people said I was working with MI6, which was quite a feather in my cap, I suppose. And I conducted over 20 interviews with experts. And I'm not going to go into everything that was said in the interviews. I can do more of that in the Q&A if you're interested. But I got some good insights from the interviews as to and some good support for the theory of ethnic vigilantism from the interviews. So one of my interlocutors online, who went by the handle Uznik Savesti, told me that Jewish memorials desecrate our land, so we desecrate them. Right here is the logic of proportionality. They have done X to us, we are doing X back to them. That is why we're committing this violence. Secondly, skinheads told me, everybody who's got an A to D, or a subject C and D on my in-person interviews. So some of my in-person interviews told me that African students in Moscow were involved in drug dealing and prostitution, including being responsible in part for Russia's escalating AIDS epidemic at the time, and so violence against them was justified. Subject D told me, as I understand it, all the good Caucasians stay on their motherland and all the bad ones come here. So what we have to do is force them back to the motherland using our violence, or dissuade them, preferably dissuade them from coming here in the first place. And then subject C says something very revealing regarding the Roma, saying this problem is insoluble. If you can't solve the problem, then the solution is simple. You have to kill the man. So right there is the idea that if we tried everything else, now we have to go to the end solution. So, my conclusion was that ethnic violence takes different forms depending on the stereotypical association of the other's criminal act. I tested this, or evaluated this, in 2 other cases in my book. The first case being the case of neo-Cossacks in southern Russia, in Krasnodar Krai and in Rostov-on-Don, who using violence against Meskhetian Turks. Particularly interesting because in Rostov there was little to no violence, whereas in Krasnodar there was a great deal of violence. It was a kind of natural experiment. The other case was of the instances of mass mobilization before the 2011 protests. Some of the riots that had gone on around Russian cities, such as in Moscow in 2010, or in Kondopoga in 2006, and Stavropol in 2007, and Khotkova in, I think Khotkova was 2012, that was 2010 as well, excuse me. But that was an interesting case, because in Khotkova there had been no violence, whereas in all the other cases we'd seen violence. So the question was, why not? So the conclusion is that metaphors of criminality provide a coordinating rationale for collective action. They provide a guide to escalation. If we know that an ethnic group is being accused of violating of killing off large members of the ethnic minority, then we might expect to see massacre form style of violence. But also it's an early use of fake news to stir up hostilities in Russian society between skinheads and ethnic minorities. In the course of researching for a book chapter I wrote with Andreas Umland, which was published in 2018, there was evidence that emerged that some of the leaders of skinhead gangs, in particular Dmitry Dmushkin, had contacts with the Russian government, had contacts in the presidential administration. Dmushkin himself actually boasted of drinking beer with people in the presidential administration. So therefore it's possible that someone was perpetrating and orchestrating this wave of violence. And in particular, some of the imagery, Dmushkin was one of the most, I'm going to add a couple of points here. Dmushkin was one of the most prolific producers of this kind of propaganda. And again, excuse me, this is going to be quite graphic, but one of the images that I remember from seeing on the Slavic Union website was of two young, I think they were Slavic youth, I don't know if they were men or women, but they were hanging on butcher's hooks in a children's playground. That image was posted, I think it was obviously photoshopped, but if you already have that prejudice against Caucasians, it's going to inflame you. Yeah, so Dmushkin himself is a very interesting case, and again, he was responsible for a lot of this, a lot of these negative images that were deployed. Certainly, this was the opinion of the late Galina Kozhevnikova of the Savas Center before she died of natural causes. I think she died in 2010, but she told me numerous times that this was being orchestrated from above. Now, the following slide shows you skinhead violence, and as you can see, skinhead violence has really declined since its height in 2008. But the decline in skinhead violence since 2008, 2007 provides another excellent test of the theory of ethnic vigilantism, because we would expect to see a decline in hate speech and a decline in these criminal stereotypes at the same time as we see a decline in the hypothesized end product, which is, of course, ethnic violence. It's also the hitherto unnoticed, the subject of one of my next publications is actually on the decline of this violence, and which has been the product of suppression by the Russian authorities, but also the policing tactics they've used. So the police have increased their policing of hate speech, as well as actually closing down on these groups themselves. That's a publication which is going to, or a submission, which is going to be entered with Olga Yakimova of Urals Federal University, and hopefully will be coming out in theoretical criminology. So I'll leave it there and open the floor for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this really fascinating discussion. I have several questions, but I would like to open the floor. And please, could you introduce yourself? Yes, sir.
Hi, Mike Iroshis. Two questions. One is the violence more or less confined to smaller cities? Because I traveled to Russia from 2012 to 2016 quite frequently, and I never saw anything in the major cities. And the second question is, isn't there still a mandatory conscription draft in Russia? So are these skinheads pre-draft or post-draft?
Excellent questions, thank you. So in terms of the geography of violence, the centres of violence, St. Petersburg, I believe, had the highest rate per capita, and Moscow also had a large amount of violence. Other centres were Voronezh and Krasnodar. So this is mostly an urban phenomenon, which again makes sense because that's where people go to migrate in order to get work and find jobs. And so the ethnic minorities have to be there if they're going to be attacked. In terms of your second question about the conscription, I believe there is still. I think what I've heard is that they're trying to overcome the conscription. They're trying to get rid of conscription, but it's still, I believe, it's still in place. Certainly, at the time I was conducting my research, it was in place, and I knew a number of people who actually paid their way to get out of conscription. these things can be, reasons can be invented why you can't serve in the army if you have enough money, that kind of thing. Certainly the army was a very powerful mechanism for recruiting skinheads when former soldiers would return from their service in Chechnya and tell stories of armed terrorists hiding behind every rock or every pillar. I believe it's Belikov who estimates that 1.5 million men served in the Chechen wars, and these people returned to their hometowns to spread these stories of, well, we're looking out for these people. But the real answer to whether this is pre or post conscription is I'm not sure. The people I talked to later, the people I talked to, the in-person interviews that I conducted were mostly post-conscription. Some of them were pre-conscription.
Yes.
Ashlyn Cowell, American Enterprise Institute. I have a follow-up question about the distribution of the violence. I was wondering if there's any correlation between the number of skinheads or violence regarding the Russian republics, because the republics have a higher number of different ethnicities, and so I was wondering if maybe there's less violence or less active members in the republics.
Mm-hmm. The best data that I have seen suggests that there are skinheads in the ethnic republics where they feel outnumbered, and that's a powerful recruiting mechanism. I've seen data from Kalmykia, for example, where there's been this impression of genocide of Russians, and they say, we have to organise to defend ourselves. Tatarstan, yeah, Tatarstan also. So, and particularly in the southern, in the North Caucasus, the southern region. So, though they're not republics, in Stavropol and Kherson. And in fact, they've imported and translated into Russian the slogan of prominent American racist David Lane. He has the so-called 14 words, which are we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, and they've translated that directly into Russian. And one of the things they'll do to salute each other on the websites or to say hello is use this term, which is 14. Another one is 88, which sounds like a hard hit number.
Marinka?
We're at the George Washington University. I'm wondering if you could go, not right here, but parse out the people from the Caucasus and Central Asia, because I'd like to know, I think it would be indicative of if there's a change, if people, say, from Armenia, Azerbaijan are better integrated compared to people from Tajikistan. I think that would be really useful, actually, data. But the other thing is, do you have any data for after? Did it go back up after the World Cup? Was there more violence during that period of time?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So the data that I'm showing here ends in 2015, and it's remained at a fairly low level post 2015. And I think in part that is because Russia was trying to clean up its image before the World Cup. They knew this major event was coming in 3 years' time, and so wanted to kind of throw off the stigma of racism. So it hasn't gone, as far as I've seen, it hasn't gone back up since the World Cup. It has not changed, but it's only been 3 months since the end of the World Cup. So it's really much too early to say. And in terms of your first comment about passing out the data and about passing out these different ethnic groups, I think that's an interesting future avenue that this might take. I know Lawrence Markovitz, with whom I wrote a paper, he's done this. He's passed out the groups. So that might be an interesting way forward with this in the future.
Can I follow with the question that is in a sense also following what Marinta did and kind of pushing you on your explanation of this decrease of skinhead activism? So of course you mentioned more kind of repression and kind of policing hate speech online, but I was wondering, I'm not sure if it's enough to explain how suddenly this big number of people, like if we were talking about 50,000, can be kind of shrinking. And what I have been noticing, and I wanted to have your feedback on that, is that because you worked also on soccer, hooligans, and so the way the Russian government has been managing the decline of soccer-related violence has been also to kind of channel all these fan clubs around the Spartak and so on. So what I wanted to ask you is that do you think that the decrease in skinhead activism is also linked to the rise and the huge money the government is putting in patriotic military education for young people? Because I have been following all these young patriotic clubs, and you know the fashion for martial art, for Sambo. When you go to these martial art clubs, honestly, the young guys who are there, they are not quite different on many aspects that if they were part. I mean, it's less violent on the street because they have been channeled, but the kind of, aesthetic and ideology or kind of youth gang subculture is still there. So I wonder if there hasn't been a way of channeling this kind of youth pool of people under some more kind of control umbrellas.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And it reminds me of Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone, which I believe inspired the song "Take the Skinheads Bowling." Right. So give them something to do, get them off the streets, try building some social capital. As you can see in the chart, and I think there's something to that. I think there is really something to the idea of let's form a way of directing this aggression. Let's take the skinheads bowling. As I forget who sung that, but it was quite a popular song at one point. A lot of people have explained the decline in skinhead activism by reference to the Donbass conflict, but as my chart here shows, skinhead activism in 2014 was already way down from its peak. So I do think I don't think there's one simple explanation for this. I think there's a number of different explanations. It's the combating of an atomistic, an alienated ideology, which the skinheads really exemplify. And it's also integration through things like sport and the proliferation of such clubs. But it's also clamping down on these groups and on these leaders. Demushkin, who as I mentioned, Kozhevnikova and thought was a Kremlin plant. He's actually been, as I'm sure you know, he's been in prison so many times in recently. He turned on the government in 2011 and joined the protests, and since then he seems to have wound up in jail an awful lot. And now he's rather a sad, middle-aged figure who sort of doesn't have, he's a kind of a sad middle-aged figure. So who's still spouting out this ideology of nationalism or racism and hanging out with 18-year-olds. So I think there's a lot to that, and I think that's a really interesting way to explain this. But again, it's part of a combination of strategies and not just one alone.
Yeah. Other question? Yes.
Iyame Ogushulan from the Voice of America. Do you see, is there a difference or is there a line that divides the criminal aspect of violence that you're talking about and political aspect of it? In some cases, if you're talking about just overall violence in the streets, whether it's skinheads or any sort of organized violence, there is a criminal aspect to it, but also besides the ethnic, there could be some political undertones to it. For example, towards the North Caucasus representatives or South Caucasus. In your research, have you seen that difference between the two sides, or is it sort of all mixed up?
So the literature on skinheads suggests they organise in groupuscles. They organise in these small groups that go out in packs and sometimes go hunting for foreigners. So I'm not sure that's the best way to access this question. But in the case of the Cossacks, I do think there's something there. I think there's, the Cossacks in Krasnodar Krai were being used very strongly to police migration from the North Caucasus, and in many cases physically stop groups from entering in or passing through particular pieces of the region. So in the case I looked at, the Meskhetian Turks, they were used explicitly, for I think 15 years. They kept up this campaign of just denying the Meskhetian Turks access to goods and to services, and saying you're not welcome here, until eventually they actually got resettled in the United States by the State Department, including some in Dayton, which is quite close to my house. So I've gone on there and talked to the community a few times. So I think there is a difference, but again, it's something that should be built upon in the future.
Yeah, so thanks for a very interesting talk. I guess I'm curious, like, how you see the skinheads fitting into the broader spectrum of sort of Russian, nationalists or, racists. Are they just kind of like one small element of kind of a larger spectrum, or kind of how do they fit in? Are they sort of just the extremist element, the whole? Are they something kind of separate? It's really kind of isolated from all the rest because they're sort of Nazi sort of overtones, or
so I think
so how do they kind of fit into the bigger picture of kind of these sort of Russian extremist nationalists, maybe you call them?
So yeah, thank you. I think that the skinheads, while their Nazi ideology certainly does alienate a number of nationalist groups in Russia, because of course, look at the sacrifice of the Russian people or the Soviet people during the Second World War. So of course, it alienates some elements of the nationalist movement. It doesn't alienate all of them. And interestingly, just talking about the Cossacks, there's a number of Cossacks who pretty much espouse the same ideology in Krasnodar, the kind of white power ideology from the West, saying, we have to defend our people, we have to defend our interests. So I view them as just one part of the broader Russian scene, and the Russian nationalist scene, one part which often alienates the rest of the other actors in the Russian nationalist scene, but sometimes can meet up with their goals. So I guess I'm kind of going both ways on that question.
If I could just follow up, I mean, to what extent do you think skinheads have some kind of broader sympathy among broader parts of the population? Are they just like reviled by 99%? Or, do they have, these people who, maybe they wouldn't themselves become skinheads, but, maybe have some level of tolerance or understanding for what they do and kind of have some kind of sympathy for them. I mean, I don't know if there's surveys on that or just, from your field research or impressions. I'd be, wonder what you thought.
I actually talked to a number of people. It's a great question. I actually talked to a number of people. And one of the skinhead quotes is coming back to me now. It seems apples like this time. They said Hitler did everything right except he forgot Russians are Aryans, right? So he just made this big one fatal mistake of attacking Russians. And I do think there is some broader sympathy for some of these ideas. What I didn't present today was an analysis of the mass media, which is in my book, but it shows there's some degree of similarity of the stereotypes deployed about these particular groups in the mass media, as well as in the skinhead media. But anecdotally and impressionistically from my field research, I met with babushkas, for example, who would say, look, these boys are just misguided, but they're sticking up for their communities and that's really good. So it was always qualified. It was never sort of out and out, this is bad. There was a sort of an understanding of, and I didn't talk to very many, so again, it is only an anecdotal opinion, but there was this impression that what they're doing is in some respects it's okay because we don't like the way our culture is changing, we don't like the way the society is changing, and in part these guys are trying to prevent that. And I don't know enough about other cases to know whether that's also the case in racists in Germany or in France or in Britain or anywhere else, but I imagine it's quite a similar case in other situations as well, where these people are viewed as, we don't like their ideology, we don't like what they're saying, we don't like the Nazi symbolism, but we have some measure of agreement with what they're doing. Does that answer your question?
sir.
You don't hear about it too much anymore, but several years ago, there was a motorcycle club that Putin was sort of linked into, and they were
The Night Wolves.
they were like riding into Poland or trying to get access to Poland and other countries, and
Right.
the idea was that they were going to cause some kind of extreme violence. And what's the current status of that? And does that something like that sort of breed more extremism on the part of skinheads and other groups?
As I mentioned, the skinheads are at a low ebb right now in part because of the policing of their groups. The Night Wolves, I believe, they were used by Putin in the annexation of Crimea and in other cases. And the dominant image they took was from the Hell's Angels, this kind of image that came from the movies, where they were, they're kind of this very aggressive group who were there to instigate and provoke violence. As to whether that succeeded in provoking violence, it may well have. I simply don't know enough about the particular case.
Can I add one element on that? So they stopped getting presidential administration funding in 2017. So they are no more financially supported in the last 2 years, but they are still quite visible. But it's mostly a business association now. They do tattoo, so everything motorcycle. They have a lot of kind of these big cultural kind of pyrotechnical shows celebrating Crimea annexation. So it just became a kind of ultra-patriotic business. But what I think is interesting is that the few times where they were involved in some violence, it was not the kind of ethnic violence you were describing. It was mostly against LGBT community or any kind of gay demonstration, and against people who were too secular or what they were calling desecrating religious symbols. So in fact, it was targeting mostly other Russians for their own perspective, but not so much the ethnic side that skinheads were kind of obsessed with.
And you can look at the Cossacks, who in 2014 famously whipped Pussy Riot, right? The Sochi Olympics, because they were bringing shame on Russia. They were sort of shaming Russia on the world stage as being another example of this kind of use of violence to punish political dissidents.
Will?
I was going to follow up on conversation there. Do you think the state repression against these skinheads will continue now that the World Cup has ended in Sochi before that?
I think obviously this is speculation, but I think the Kremlin got its fingers burnt. I think they weren't expecting. They got their fingers burnt in 2010, particularly with Dmushkin, when he turned on them and joined the protesters, and I don't think anyone was expecting that. So I think there is a sort of, there's a sense in which this group can be useful, but if we employ them too much, they're dangerous. So I think there's going to be a reluctance to return to this to return to this group. To be sure, there'll be other groups, and the Night Wolves, and I think the Cossacks are very popular now. Actually, I'm working on the Cossacks as we talked about earlier, but I'm working on the Cossacks for another project I have. So I think the state is instead going to try and use more readily manipulable groups, more readily manageable groups, and ones that won't turn on it, so to speak.
My name is Michelle Kazarian. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm sorry if you already addressed in the lecture, I came in late. To what extent do you think the representation of communities in Russia that have been on the receiving end of violence and attacks, their representation in arts and culture and in popular culture figures into these kinds of attacks, or maybe in a more general way, the conception of Russians defined against the other, and how that relationship might figure into these attacks, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned during the presentation that there was very little representation of the Roma in skinhead media, and so I assumed that there was some other way in which the negative valence given to this identity group was replicated and perpetuated, and I think that's exactly what we're talking about. So again, some of the interview subjects I talked to said, they gave very stereotypical impressions of the Roman, like cross my palm with silver, always begging on street corners and that sort of thing. But particularly images that were drawn from their representation in films that had taken place earlier. So I think there is a story there, but again, this was focusing, my core focus was on how they're depicted in the media as a particular group.
And if I can follow on that, on this kind of construction of the image of the other, did you see the arrival of the anti-Muslim narrative? Because of course the anti-ethnic one, the anti-Caucasian or anti-Central Asian one is one big side. But now there is a kind of rise of, the point is not the ethnicity of these groups, it's the fact that they are Muslim. And so I wonder if in your data in the 2000s, this kind of anti-Muslim narrative was already there, or it's arrived later and everything was kind of ethno-centered?
The principal focus was on the ethnicity of the other rather than the religion of the other. And in fact, Russia being an officially one of the religions of Russia is that of Islam. So there wasn't that much focus on the negative aspects of others' religion, but there was a great deal of focus on the ethnic side of things.
Do we have a question? Yes.
Have you seen any connections, associations, any sort of contact between these groups and the church or church-associated groups?
So, again, I keep going back to the Cossacks. The Cossacks got a very strong role of the church. The church plays a very important role in organising Cossack communities, which claim, to be particularly venerating the faith. The Cossack communities I work with in Tatarstan, actually, the Cossack community I work with in Tatarstan was organised by a priest. I haven't seen, many of these groups are officially atheists, right? They're sort of a-religious because most religions would not tolerate the kind of ideology that they want to promulgate. So I would say yes for Cossacks and other kinds of ethnic vigilantes, but no for the case of these skinhead groups.
If I may ask the last question. There was a lot of discussion like 2015, 16, 17 about, the connection between US white supremacists and the Russian skinheads, so I wanted to also have your opinion on that. I mean, we have seen some small exchanges of ideas, symbol, names, people, but in your data or when you were doing interview, was there anything kind of coming from the US, like reading David Duke, quoting Ku Klux Klan, I don't know, which kind of cultural element could come from the US white supremacists, or was that so minimal that it was not noticeable until very small cases a few years ago?
No, it was very noticeable. In fact, a lot of the early skinhead groups, and I got some DVDs from these skinheads showing me some of the activities and some of the ideology, some of the things they say about each other online. I'm not sophisticated enough to use the dark web, so I couldn't access this myself. But some of these groups, they were dressed up. Actually, you had Russians dressed up like Ku Klux Klan members, and one video where they're all dressed up like Ku Klux Klan members and supposedly dismember somebody who perpetrated some kind of crime, according to an old Russian tradition. I've already mentioned the 14 words of the American racist David Lane. And in fact, when I was in Krasnodar in 2015, I saw written in Cyrillic on the wall, I forget what the name of the main street in Kazan is, but when I was in Tatarstan in 2015, I saw somebody had written David Lane in Cyrillic on the wall next to a shop, and it was incredible. It's sort of like, this is unreal. This is an obscure American racist figure. No, sorry, they'd written William Pierce on the wall, and this was incredible because Pierce, for those of you who don't know, he's the author of a really terrible book called The Turner Diaries, which is a fictionalized account of a forthcoming race war. And the narrative is absolutely awful. It's it's full of it's really not very detailed, and it's just very, very badly written. But the fact that somebody had written William Pierce, they'd scrawled it on the side of a shop next to, I think the shop was selling Tatar ethnic goods in the middle of Kazan, was absolutely incredible. And it just said, look, there's something here, right? There's something about these rallied Western groups have penetrated into Russia, and they penetrated and really are affecting people's attitudes in Russia. That a youth would go, presumably it was a youth, would go out and scrawl this on the side of a building. Now there are also, of course, after the 2016 election, there are also reports about links between particularly Richard Spencer's National Policy Institute and Russian groups. I wrote a paper which came out in 2013 on a conference in Moscow in 2006 called The White World's Future, where David Duke was among the invitees to attend this conference, which claimed that Russia was the white world's future, and the future salvation for the white race will be in Siberia. I think they claim it's this really preposterous notion, but it's interesting for what it says. So there's definite evidence of links between them. There's definite evidence that Russian skinheads or Russian neo-Nazis, Russian youth are aware of some of these ideas of people like Pierce and David Lane and some of the other unsavoury elements that we have here in the West. But there's also reciprocal evidence. Spencer was supposed to, I believe he was supposed to meet Dugin in Budapest in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. That meeting actually fell through because Dugin, I believe, was unable to get a visa. So Spencer travelled all the way to Hungary to work with Dugin, but didn't manage to meet him in the end. So, but there's definite evidence of connection, and definite evidence of connection.
Okay, great. Well, I think it's time for us already to stop. We could continue the discussion for long, but I now invite you to have a more informal discussion if you want to continue interact with Richard. And please join me in thanking him for his